Joe Rogan thought he could humiliate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez by exposing her as an economically illiterate bartender who'd stumbled into Congress. What happened next destroyed his podcast empire and cost him $200 million in the most spectacular media meltdown in podcasting history. The Joe Rogan Experience studio in Austin felt different that Tuesday afternoon in October. Usually the converted warehouse space buzzed with the easy energy of two people just talking the kind of casual conversation that had made Rogan the undisputed king of podcasting. But today, sitting across from him in the guest chair, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez brought a different energy entirely. AOC wore a simple black blazer and carried a leather portfolio that looked like it had been through several congressional hearings. She'd agreed to appear on the show after months of requests from Rogan's team, who'd pitched it as a chance to have a substantive conversation about climate policy and economic theory with someone willing to listen to different perspectives. What she didn't know was that Rogan had spent the past week preparing what he privately called his AOC takedown, a systematic humiliation designed to expose her as an intellectual fraud who'd fooled the media with good looks and socialist talking points. Rogan had been increasingly irritated by AOC's media presence and policy proposals, seeing her as the perfect embodiment of everything wrong with progressive politics. His research team had compiled what they called a comprehensive opposition file, quotes from her college years' controversial statements about capitalism, and policy positions they believed would make her look radical and naive to his predominantly male working-class audience. As the cameras rolled and Rogan settled into his familiar interviewing style, he launched into what he thought would be a friendly conversation that would gradually reveal AOC's intellectual limitations. "So you're the congresswoman everyone's talking about," Rogan said, leaning back in his chair with his trademark casual confidence. "I gotta be honest, I don't usually have politicians on, but I'm curious about this Green New Deal thing. It sounds pretty ambitious." AOC smiled, opening her portfolio. "Thanks for having me, Joe. I appreciate the platform, and I think your audience might be interested in understanding what we're actually proposing versus what they've heard in the media." Yeah, that's what I want to get into," Rogan replied, his tone still friendly, but with an edge that suggested he was setting a trap. "Because when I look at some of these proposals, guaranteed jobs, free healthcare, retrofitting every building in America, it sounds like you're talking about spending trillions of dollars without really understanding how economics works." Was his first probe designed to sound reasonable, while implying that AOC was naive about basic economic principles? "That's interesting that you mention economics," AOC replied, flipping to a marked page in her portfolio. "What specific economic principles do you think I'm misunderstanding?" Rogan shifted slightly, not expecting the question to be turned back on him so quickly. "Well, I mean basic supply and demand. You can't just mandate that everyone gets a job and expect the economy to work. That's not how markets function." He leaned forward with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged on his understanding of the economics. "Look, I get that you want to help people, but you can't just ignore economic reality because it doesn't fit your political goals." AOC nodded thoughtfully. "Joe, can I ask about your background in economics? Have you studied market theory, macroeconomics, fiscal policy?" The question caught Rogan off guard. "I mean, I understand business. I've built successful companies, negotiated contracts worth hundreds of millions. I understand how the real world works." "Ah, and that's great," AOC said, "but business experience and economic theory are different things. Understanding how to negotiate a contract doesn't necessarily mean you understand how labor markets function or how government spending affects aggregate demand." She opened her portfolio wider. "I ask because I have a degree in economics and international relations from Boston University. I've studied market failures, externalities, fiscal multipliers, and monetary policy. So when you say I don't understand basic supply and demand, I'm curious what specific aspect of my policy proposals you think violates economic principles." Rogan's confident expression started to flicker. This wasn't the defensive response he'd expected. "Well, for example," he said, trying to regain momentum, "you're talking about guaranteeing everyone a job. That's not how labor markets work. You can't just create jobs out of thin air." "Actually, that's exactly how labor markets work during recessions," AOC replied calmly. "It's called counter-cyclical fiscal policy, and it's been standard economic theory since Keynes. When private demand falls, government spending can maintain employment and prevent economic collapse." She pulled out a chart. We saw this during the 2008 financial crisis, during the Great Depression, and during COVID. Government job programs don't create jobs out of thin air. They mobilize unemployed resources to address unmet social needs. Shake it in. Rogan was starting to look uncomfortable, but he pressed forward with his prepared attack. But you're talking about retrofitting every building in America, guaranteeing everyone healthcare, massive government spending. Where's all this money going to come from? You can't just print money forever. Joe, when's the last time you read an economics textbook? AOC asked, her tone still friendly, but carrying more weight now. Because what you're describing as impossible is actually how every major economy functions. She flipped to another page. Government spending doesn't require printing money. It requires mobilizing existing economic capacity. When unemployment is high and infrastructure is crumbling, government investment creates value by putting people to work on productive activities. Rogan tried to interrupt, but AOC continued smoothly. Take the interstate highway system. That was massive government spending that created millions of jobs and generated trillions in economic value. The internet you're using to broadcast this show, government-funded research. GPS touchscreen technology, the lithium-ion batteries in your phone. All government investments that created entire industries. She looked directly at him. So when you say government spending is economically impossible, you're essentially arguing against the foundation of modern economic development. Rogan was visibly flustered now, his usual quick wit completely absent. But that's different. Those were infrastructure projects, not socialist giveaways. Socialist giveaways. AOC repeated, raising an eyebrow. Joe, can you define socialism for me? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rogan opened his mouth, then closed it clearly, struggling to provide a coherent definition. I mean, it's when the government controls everything, when you take away people's freedom to choose. That's not socialism, AOC interrupted gently. Socialism is worker ownership of the means of production. What you're describing sounds more like authoritarianism, which is a completely different concept. She leaned forward slightly. The Green New Deal doesn't propose government ownership of private businesses. It proposes government investment in clean energy infrastructure, job training programs, and research and development, the same kind of policies that built American economic dominance in the 20th century. Rogan was starting to sweat, realizing that his usual approach of confident assertions wasn't working against someone who actually knew what she was talking about. Look, I'm not an economist, he said defensively, but I know that you can't just spend unlimited amounts of money without consequences. You're absolutely right, AOC agreed. And that's why every policy proposal I've made includes detailed funding mechanisms and economic impact analyses. She pulled out another document. The Green New Deal would be funded through a combination of carbon pricing, financial transaction taxes, and progressive taxation on high earners. The Congressional Budget Office estimates it would generate $2.3 trillion in economic activity over 10 years, while creating 15 million jobs. She looked at him directly. But here's my question for you, Joe. If you admit you're not an economist, why are you confidently asserting that my economic proposals are wrong? Wouldn't it make more sense to ask questions rather than make claims about subjects you haven't studied? The studio was dead, silent except for the hum of recording equipment. Rogan stared at her clearly, having no response to someone who just politely but thoroughly exposed his ignorance. I guess I'm just skeptical of big government programs, he said weakly. That's fair, AOC replied. Skepticism is healthy, but effective skepticism requires understanding what you're being skeptical about. She closed her portfolio and looked directly into the camera. Joe's audience deserves better than uninformed opinions presented as facts. When we're talking about policies that affect millions of people's lives, we need to base our discussions on evidence research and actual economic theory. She turned back to Rogan. I came here hoping to have a substantive conversation about climate policy and economic solutions. Instead, I've spent the last hour correcting basic misunderstandings about how economics works. Rogan tried one more desperate attempt to salvage the interview. But you'll have to admit some of your ideas are pretty radical. Radical compared to what AOC asked, compared to doing nothing while the planet burns, compared to letting millions of Americans go bankrupt from medical bills, compared to watching our infrastructure crumble while billionaires get tax cuts. Her voice grew stronger. Joe, what's radical is pretending that our current economic system is working for ordinary Americans. What's radical is ignoring climate change because addressing it might inconvenience fossil fuel companies. What's radical is defending an economic status quo that's failing most of your listeners. She stood up and began removing her microphone. I appreciate the platform, but I think your audience would be better served by hosts who do their homework before making claims about complex policy issues. Muffler, Rogan sat in stunned silence as she gathered her things. We still have an hour left in the show. I think I've made my point, AOC replied. When someone admits they don't understand economics but spends an hour attacking economic policies, that's not a conversation, that's performance art. Nana Hanarn, she looked directly into the camera one more time. To Joe's listeners, you deserve better than hosts who substitute confidence for knowledge. When someone talks about economics, climate science, or public policy, ask them about their qualifications. Ask them to cite their sources. Don't let anyone tell you that expertise doesn't matter. Sonam. And with that, she walked out of the studio, leaving Rogan sitting alone with his microphone and his shattered credibility. The interview had been live streaming on Spotify and YouTube, and clips were already going viral before AOC had even left the building. Within an hour, Warren Rogan Exposed was trending on Twitter. The moment when she'd asked him to define socialism was being shared millions of times along with his stammering non-response. But the real damage came from the economic education she'd provided. Viewers who'd never understood concepts like fiscal multipliers or countercyclical policy were suddenly armed with actual knowledge, making Rogan's previous economic commentary look even more ignorant in comparison. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Economics professors began sharing the clips as examples of how to handle economic misinformation. Policy experts praised AOC's ability to explain complex concepts clearly. Even some conservative economists admitted that her explanations of basic economic theory were accurate. But the most damaging response came from Rogan's own audience. Comments on his social media pages were brutal. How did he not know what socialism was? She made him look like an amateur. I'm embarrassed for him. Maybe I should actually learn about economics instead of just listening to Joe. The financial consequences were swift and severe. Within 48 hours, 3 major advertisers had pulled their sponsorships from the Joe Rogan Experience, citing concerns about the host's lack of preparation and spread of economic misinformation. Spotify's stock price dropped as investors worried about the controversy surrounding their most expensive content acquisition. More damaging was the cultural shift. For years, Rogan had built his brand on being the guy who asked tough questions and cut through BS with common sense. But AOC had exposed him as someone who confused ignorance with skepticism, who mistook confident assertions for actual knowledge. Media critics began analyzing Rogan's approach to complex topics, finding a pattern of uninformed commentary presented as wisdom. Academic experts started fact-checking his previous episodes, revealing numerous instances where he'd made false claims about science, economics, and policy. The breaking point came when Spotify executives, facing mounting pressure from advertisers and subscribers, called an emergency meeting to discuss Rogan's contract. The interview with AOC had become a liability, showing that their star podcaster could be easily outclassed by someone with actual expertise. 3 weeks after the disastrous interview, Spotify announced that they were restructuring their content strategy and would not be renewing Rogan's exclusive contract when it expired. Industry insiders knew what that meant. The $200 million deal that had made Rogan the king of podcasting was over. Rogan tried to control the damage with a series of follow-up episodes where he brought on economists to discuss the topics AOC had raised. But it was too late. The image of him being schooled by a congresswoman he'd tried to humiliate was permanently burned into the public consciousness. 6 months later, Rogan was back to recording in his garage, his audience diminished, and his cultural influence severely reduced. The man who'd built an empire on confident ignorance had been destroyed by someone who'd actually done her homework. AOC, meanwhile, saw her national profile reach new heights. The interview had showcased not just her policy expertise, but her ability to educate and inform while dismantling bad faith arguments. Political strategists from both parties began studying her approach as a model for how to handle hostile media. In her first major interview after Rogan's contract cancellation, AOC was asked what she'd hoped to accomplish in that confrontation. "I wanted to show people the difference between actual expertise and performed authority," she said. Joe Rogan had built his brand on asking tough questions, but he wasn't asking questions. He was making assertions based on ignorance. Autor, she continued. His audience deserved better than confident misinformation. They deserved someone who would actually research topics before discussing them, who would admit when they didn't know something instead of pretending to be an expert. The interviewer asked if she felt vindicated by Rogan's downfall. This was never about destroying Joe Rogan personally, AOC replied. It was about holding media figures accountable for the information they spread. When someone has a platform that reaches millions of people, they have a responsibility to be accurate. She paused. Joe's contract cancellation wasn't punishment. It was a natural consequence of being exposed as unprepared and uninformed. In an age where misinformation can have real-world consequences, audiences are demanding better from their media sources. The lesson was clear. In an era of social media and instant fact-checking, confident ignorance can't survive contact with actual expertise. And when someone who's done their homework confronts someone who's been coasting on charisma and attitude preparation, beats performance every time. Joe Rogan thought he could humiliate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez by exposing her as an economically illiterate socialist who'd fooled the media with good looks and radical talking points. Instead, he exposed himself as someone who'd confused confidence with knowledge, who'd built an empire on uninformed opinions presented as wisdom. His $200 million downfall became a perfect example of what happens when performed authority meets actual expertise. When someone who's studied their subject faces someone who's just talked about it. And when preparation confronts the kind of confident ignorance that had somehow become mistaken for insight in American media.